For 2,000 years, we called it a trade route. DNA says it was something else. The Silk Road, 7,000 kilometers from the Chinese capital to the Mediterranean coast. The textbook version is simple. Silk went west, gold went east, merchants met in the middle. Goods traveled the full distance, people did not. That was the assumption. A relay system of regional merchants passing goods along. Chinese silk appeared in Roman markets. Roman glass appeared in Chinese tombs. But the people who made the silk and the people who bought it supposedly never met. Mountains, deserts, and 3,000 kilometers of hostile terrain separated them. One merchant carried goods a few hundred kilometers and sold them to the next. Like a bucket brigade, the goods moved thousands of kilometers, while each person moved only a fraction. No one would have walked the entire length. That was the logic. And then geneticists started testing the bones buried along the route, not the trade goods, not the coins or the pottery or the silk. The human remains themselves. The people who were buried along the Silk Road, and their DNA told a story the textbooks had missed for centuries. People did travel the entire length, not occasionally, routinely, not just merchants, families, soldiers, slaves, entire communities. The Silk Road was not a trade relay. It was a migration highway, and the graves prove it, and the hams prove it. The evidence begins in the far west of China, Xinjiang province. Xinjiang sits at the crossroads where east meets west. For millennia, oasis towns along the desert's edge served as rest stops for travelers. Archaeologists have been excavating burial sites in this region for decades. What they found in the graves was unexpected. The excavations have been running for decades across dozens of sites. More than 20 major cemeteries have yielded human remains suitable for DNA analysis. Each skeleton is a data point. Each genome is a migration record written in base pairs. Individuals buried in Bronze Age and Iron Age. Xinjiang looked nothing like the modern local population. Tall stature, light hair features that looked Western European, not East Asian. For years, scholars debated who these people were. Were they European migrants who crossed the continent thousands of years ago? Were they descended from nearby steppe populations who happened to look different? In 2021, an international team extracted ancient DNA from the Tarim Basin mummies. The results surprised everyone. The mummies were not Western migrants. They were genetically local. They descended from an ancient population called the ancient North Eurasians, a group that was already living in Central and Inner Asia before the Silk Road existed. Their appearance was misleading. Genetics told a different story from what the faces suggested. But here is where the Silk Road evidence actually begins. Because when researchers tested burials from later periods, the actual Silk Road era, the genetic picture changed completely. Individual after individual showed mixed ancestry. East Asian and Western Eurasian combined. Not cultural exchange. Not borrowed pottery styles. Actual genetic mixing. People from opposite ends of the continent were not just trading with each other. They were living together, having children together, forming communities together. The admixture was not subtle. It was not trace ancestry hiding in a few markers. 50% East Asian, 50% Western Eurasian in one person. That means one parent came from one end of the continent and the other from the opposite end. That is not trade. That is intimacy. That is shared life across impossible distances. And it happened at every major stop along the route. Merv, Kashgar, Turfan, Balf. Every crossroads city shows the same genetic blending. And the evidence is not limited to Western China. Central Asia was the geographic heart of the Silk Road. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv were where East met West for centuries. Ancient artwork from these cities already showed people of strikingly different appearances mingling. But artwork is interpretation. DNA is data. When researchers tested burials from Central Asian Silk Road cities, the results were dramatic. Individuals buried side by side in the same cemeteries had wildly different genetic backgrounds. One person with predominantly East Asian ancestry, the next with predominantly Western Eurasian, and many individuals in between 50-50 mixes, 70-30, every possible ratio. This is not a trade relay. This is a population blender. The mixing was not a one-time event. It persisted across centuries. From the Hellenistic period through the Tang Dynasty and beyond, the gene flow never stopped. Generation after generation of people with mixed continental ancestry. But the strongest evidence comes from the western end of the route. Rome, the western terminus of the Silk Road network. Roman ports received goods from across the known world, but they also received people. And the graves prove it. In cemeteries across the Roman Empire, geneticists have found individuals with East Asian ancestry. The isotope evidence is particularly powerful because it tracks individual movement. A single tooth can record the geographic journey of one person across their lifetime. Laser ablation can sample growth layers one by one, revealing where the person lived each year. One individual from a Roman cemetery shows childhood in East Asia and adulthood in Italy, not mixed ancestry, not a hint of Eastern genetics, fully East Asian genomes. Individuals born in East Asia who traveled the entire Silk Road and were buried in Roman territory, not descendants of immigrants from generations earlier. First-generation travelers. Isotopy analysis confirmed they grew up eating an East Asian diet. Their teeth carried the chemical signature of rice-based diets in a region of wheat and olive oil. Their bones told two stories: a childhood in the East and adulthood in the West. 7,000 kilometers crossed in a single lifetime. And it was not just one person. The pattern repeats across multiple sites. At Vagneri in southern Italy, a Roman imperial estate, researchers found remarkable diversity, North African ancestry, Near Eastern ancestry, and unmistakable East Asian genetic markers. These were people who worked the land of a Roman estate, not elite travelers, ordinary people, laborers. And some of them came from the other side of the world. This finding shattered the old model of the Silk Road as a simple commercial relay. Goods can be handed off at intermediate stops. Genomes cannot. If a person buried in Rome carries an East Asian genome, that person traveled to Rome. The Roman Empire was a magnet for long-distance migration. Ancient DNA from Roman-era burials in the city shows extraordinary genetic diversity. Individuals from North Africa, the Near East, and Northern Europe were all buried in the same cemeteries. Rome was not just an empire. It was a genetic melting pot fed by every road that led to it, including the Silk Road. The East Asian genetic signal in Roman Italy is small but consistent. Multiple individuals from different Roman sites carry trace to significant East Asian ancestry. Not one anomaly, a pattern. There is no other explanation. DNA does not trade. DNA moves with people, and the evidence extends to the eastern end of the route as well. Tang Dynasty China was the most cosmopolitan empire in the medieval world. Its capital, Chang'an, had a population of over 1 million. Historical texts describe foreign merchants living in dedicated neighborhoods. Sogdian, Persian, and Indian traders are well documented in Chinese historical records. Roman conquest created mass forced displacement across 3 continents. Captives from Persia, the Caucasus, and Central Asia were brought to work Roman estates. The slave trade was the Silk Road's darkest cargo, and it left genetic evidence everywhere. But DNA tells us they were not just visiting. They were staying permanently. Burials from Tang Dynasty cemeteries show individuals with substantial Western Eurasian ancestry. Married Chinese spouses were buried in Chinese tombs. Some tomb inscriptions explicitly identify the deceased as foreign-born. The DNA and the inscriptions tell the same story. Long-distance migration was routine. At Dunhuang, the western gateway of Tang China, the evidence is even more concentrated. Dunhuang was where the Silk Road entered China. Everyone passed through. The documents found in the Dunhuang caves are written in over a dozen languages: Sogdian, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Khotanese, Uyghur, even Hebrew. A linguistic map of every civilization the Silk Road connected, and the burials near Dunhuang show the same genetic diversity as the document. East Asian, Central Asian, Western Eurasian, Iranian, Indian subcontinental. Every major population group along the Silk Road is represented in a single cemetery. This is not what a trade relay looks like. This is what a migration corridor looks like. But here is where the honest researcher has to pause, because the word migration sounds voluntary. And much of this movement was not. The Roman Empire ran on enslaved labor. Millions of people were moved against their will, captured in war, sold at markets, transported across enormous distances. When we find an East Asian genome in Roman Italy, we cannot assume they chose to be there. The DNA cannot tell us whether a person traveled willingly or in chains. It can only tell us they moved, not why. And the Silk Road was not just silk and spices. It was a highway for armies too. Every empire that controlled a section of the route also moved populations by force. The Persians relocated whole communities. The Mongols deported skilled workers across their empire. Chinese dynasties brought Central Asian musicians, soldiers, and artisans to the capital. The romantic Silk Road narrative hides a much darker history of forced displacement. And there was another driver of movement that historians are only now quantifying: climate. When droughts hit the steppe, entire populations moved. Pastoral nomads who depended on grasslands had no choice but to follow the water. When the grass died, the people moved, sometimes thousands of kilometers. The genetic data shows spikes in population, mixing that align with known climate events. Was not one story. It was at least three: voluntary trade and marriage, forced displacement and slavery, climate-driven flight. All three left the same genetic signature: mixed ancestry in Silk Road graves. But DNA alone cannot tell us which driver was responsible for any single individual. That is the limitation. And pretending it does not exist would be dishonest. The climate question goes deeper than individual drought events. Tree ring records from Central Asia show recurring cycles of drought and abundance. Every drought pulse pushed pastoral populations toward the oasis cities along the Silk Road. The genetic spikes and the climate spikes line up with striking precision. When the water disappeared, the people had no choice: move or die. And when they moved, they merged with whoever was already living in the cities. The Silk Road cities were not just trading posts. They were refugee camps during climate crises. What the DNA does prove beyond any doubt is that people moved far. And often the relay model is dead. The evidence has buried it. The pre-Silk Road migration is one of the most important findings. Trade formalized what migration had already established. Bronze Age pastoral communities were already crossing the continent before anyone traded silk. The genetic mixing started with herders following grass and water across the steppe. The steppe is an open highway. No mountains, no deserts. Just grass from Hungary to Mongolia. And Seroni Rimperingtown. Now, let us look at the specific cases that prove it. In 2018, researchers published the genome of a woman buried in imperial-era Italy. Her genome was predominantly East Asian, consistent with an origin in southern China or Southeast Asia. She was buried in a simple grave. No luxury items, no markers of elite status. She was not a diplomat or a princess. She was an ordinary person buried far from home. Isotope analysis of her teeth confirmed she did not grow up eating a Mediterranean diet. She had crossed thousands of kilometers by sea through the Indian Ocean or overland through the steppe. We do not know if she chose to make that journey. We only know she made it. Case study 2 comes from the opposite end of the route, Shirenzigo in the Tian Shan Mountains. This site changed how geneticists think about the Eastern Silk Road. Burials dating from the late Bronze Age through the Iron Age revealed astonishing genetic diversity. Some individuals had predominantly Western Eurasian ancestry. Others were predominantly East Asian, and many were 50-50 mixes, first-generation offspring of parents from opposite ends of the continent. When the grass died, the people moved, sometimes thousands of kilometers. Kinship analysis revealed parent-child pairs with dramatically different ancestry profiles. A father with Western Eurasian ancestry, a mother with East Asian ancestry. Their children buried beside them. This was not a way station. This was a permanent community of mixed ancestry families. The mixing began before the classical Silk Road even existed. Radiocarbon dates place the earliest mixed burials before the Han Dynasty opened the route. The trade route followed paths that people had already been traveling for millennia. The trans-Saharan routes connected West Africa to the Mediterranean for over 2,000 years. DNA from North African burials shows increasing sub-Saharan ancestry along trade corridors. The same pattern. Every trade route tested, people moved the full distance. Hub cities on every route show the same genetic signature. Elevated diversity. Continental mixing. The Silk Road was not the cause of migration. It was built on top of routes migrants had already carved. The road did not create the movement. The movement created the road. The third case study is the most revealing of all the Sogdians. The Sogdians were an Iranian-speaking people from the region around modern Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. They dominated Silk Road trade for nearly 1,000 years. But they were not just middlemen. They were the ultimate Silk Road migrants. Sogdian trading colonies have been documented in over a dozen Chinese cities. Sogdian language inscriptions appear in monasteries from India to Mongolia. They were not occasional travelers. They established permanent communities across the entire route. And DNA from Sogdian burials shows exactly what you would expect from a migrant diaspora. Individuals identified as Sogdian by tomb inscriptions carry Central Asian genetic signatures. Their genomes match modern populations from Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, but their children tell a different story. Second-generation Sogdians in China show mixed East Asian and Central Asian ancestry. Third-generation Sogdians are genetically almost indistinguishable from local Chinese populations. Within a century of settlement, their DNA had merged into the local population. This is what migration looks like in the genetic record. Arrival, mixing, absorption. And the Sogdians were doing this for nearly 1,000 years. Wave after wave of Sogdian migrants arriving, settling, and blending into Chinese society. Each wave refreshing the Central Asian genetic signal. Each generation blending it further. At Panjikent, the best preserved Sogdian city, the evidence is written on the walls. Wall paintings show people of different ethnic backgrounds living together as neighbors. Maritime Silk Road evidence is equally compelling. Port cities along the maritime route show the same mixing pattern as overland cities. Shipwrecks from the South China Sea carried goods from at least 6 different civilizations. And the cemeteries at those ports show the same genetic signature. People stayed, people mixed. The sea routes and the land routes were part of the same system. Both moved people. Banquet scenes show Chinese, Indian, Persian, and Greek cultural elements in the same room. The art confirms what the DNA shows. These cities were genuinely multicultural. The material culture is as diverse as the genetics. Chinese bronze mirrors beside Sasanian silver coins beside Roman glass. in one grave. The objects traveled with the people, and the people stayed. Provenance analysis of the grave goods confirms origins across the entire route. The Sogdian story is the Silk Road in miniature, not a trade route. A migration pipeline that reshaped the genetics of two continents. And the Sogdians were just one group among many. Scythians, Kushans, Tocharians, Huns, Xiongnu Turks. Every empire that rose along the route moved people. Every collapse scattered them. The genetic evidence is rewriting 1,000 years of assumed history. And the technology is only getting better. The cost of ancient DNA sequencing has dropped by orders of magnitude in the past decade. What once required years of work on a single individual can now process hundreds simultaneously. And every new genome from a Silk Road burial adds another data point to the map. Hundreds of genomes have been published. Thousands more are in preparation. A new generation of researchers is approaching the question without the old assumptions. They are not asking whether people migrated. They are asking how many, how fast, and why. International collaboration has made data sets available that no single country could build alone. The political boundaries that divide the Silk Road today are irrelevant to the genetics. The genes flowed across borders that did not exist when the people were alive. The picture is becoming clearer with every study. But this evidence raises a question that goes beyond the Silk Road itself. If we were wrong about the Silk Road, what else have we gotten wrong? The Indian Ocean trade routes connected East Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia for centuries. DNA from East African coastal burials shows South Asian and Arabian genetic input. The Swahili coast was not just a marketplace. It was a genetic crossroads. Merchants from India settled permanently. Arabian traders married into local families. The same pattern as the Silk Road. People moved, genes mixed. Populations transformed. The Amber Road from the Baltic to the Mediterranean shows similar genetic signatures. Every ancient trade route we test turns out to be a migration route as well. The distinction between trade and migration may have been false all along. Trade requires relationships. Relationships require contact. Contact produces children. The genetics were inevitable. We just never bothered to check until now. And this has implications far beyond ancient history. Modern Central Asian populations carry the genetic legacy of millennia of Silk Road mixing. Their genomes are among the most admixed on the planet. Every person in Uzbekistan carries the genetic memory of 2,000 years of migration. The Silk Road did not end. It was absorbed into the people who lived on it. And that genetic legacy is now being read by a new generation of scientists. Laboratories in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and China are now leading their own ancient DNA research. The countries along the Silk Road are finally reading their own genetic history. And what they are finding confirms the same pattern everywhere they look. People moved across mountains, across deserts, across continents. Chinese institutions are now among the most active in Silk Road ancient DNA research. Recent studies from Gansu province have added dozens of new genomes to the dataset. The Hexi corridor, the narrow passage connecting China proper to the western regions, was a bottleneck. New sites are being excavated every season. New bones are being tested every month. The next 5 years will produce more data than the previous 50 combined. And every genome will add another line to the story the textbooks missed. The story that the Silk Road was always about people. Not just silk. Everyone traveling the Silk Road in either direction passed through this corridor. And the burials along the corridor show exactly what you would expect from a migration funnel. Increasing genetic diversity century after century. More mixing, more movement, more people. The corridor was not just a passage. It was a melting pot that operated for over 1,000 years. The genetic diversity there rivals anything seen in the modern world, not as rare exceptions, as the fundamental operating principle of the route was always about people. We just called it
trade.
And the evidence keeps accumulating. New papers appear every month, each one adding more genomes, more connections, more evidence, each one confirming the same conclusion.
The relay model was a guess, a comfortable assumption that lasted 2 centuries.
It was based on what seemed logical, not on what the bones actually showed, because no one had tested the bones until now.
Here is one Moromashino. Here is what we know for certain.
People traveled the full length of the Silk Road. Not goods passed between middlemen. The evidence comes from every section of the route. China, Central Asia, Iran, the Mediterranean. Hundreds of individuals, dozens of sites spanning over 2,000 years.
The pattern is not ambiguous. It is overwhelming.
The Silk Road moved people the way rivers move water, continuously, in both directions for millennia. And every grave along the way is a data point that proves it. Today, we still think of trade routes as paths for goods, not people. We count the cargo, we measure the tariffs, we track the shipping lanes, but the human traffic along modern trade routes follows exactly the same ancient pattern. The corridors China is building today follow the same paths the Sogdians walked. The Belt and Road Initiative is the modern Silk Road, and it is already moving people. 2,000 years from now, geneticists will read our bones the same way. The mixing never stopped. The Silk Road just changed its name.
We told ourselves a story about a trade route. DNA told us a different one.
A story about people, about families, about communities that defied distance, about children born between two worlds, buried at the crossroads of civilization.
The textbooks called it the Silk Road. The DNA calls it something else entirely.
A human highway connecting the Pacific to the Atlantic, one lifetime at a time. If trade routes are migration routes, what does that change about everything else we thought we knew?
That is the question the Silk Road graves are forcing us to ask.
And the bones keep answering. Every grave they open tells the same story. The road was not for silk. It was for people.